the bees are quite hidden away. So the first you know about it, one will come down, as this one did, hovered in front of me, just stung me on the head. And that was all right. But then, of course, it brings all its mates back. And I would say within about 10 seconds, they were going up my nose, they were crawling in my eyes. I had them in my mouth. They were in my ears. They'd gone through the air vents on my climbing helmet. They'd gone down my back.
You're thinking a bit differently about bees now, aren't you? Yeah, be honest. It's time for another Tree Lady Talks. Our guest today has core skills that include, and I'm taking this straight off his website, blue chip long lens animal behaviour, aerial cable cam systems, presenter-led sync and high-level technical rope access. Now, he's a lovely, lovely guy, and when we did this interview with James, it was really, really illuminating. But I have to say, he's in a very dangerous business. The squeamish amongst you might not want to listen further than, yes, the bot flies, the pants that endured for many, many days, and the bees, which we've also got into and heard a clip of at the front of this. It's James Aldred in this episode of Tree Lady Talks.
So welcome to James Aldred, wildlife cameraman specialising in forests, and you're quite keen on climbing a tree. So hello, James.
Hi there. Hi. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Well, it all started for me. My first trip outside of Europe in 2018, we were at the airport and Noel said, why don't we get this book, The Man Who Climbs Trees? And we were off to Bali, which was really exciting for me. And I devoured this book in a few days amongst a sort of tropical rainforest, thinking, could that be me? But truth is, I am a tree expert, but I'm scared of heights. So, James, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, I always wanted to do wildlife photography and wildlife camera work. And I was always into climbing, as a kid and as a teenager. And luckily, I grew up in the New Forest, and a lot of my mates went in to be tree surgeons and foresters through what was then the YTS, the youth training scheme, and so by default, I sort of picked it up. I was still, doing my, what was I doing then? End of GCSEs and A-levels and all that sort of stuff. So they'd left school a bit earlier than me, and they were doing that. But on the weekends, I had free time to go out and play. And they introduced me to ropes and harnesses back in the days when harnesses were made of leather and there were no leg loops and there was no kern mantle rope. It was all twisted ply nylon and, frayed odds and ends. And just got the bug for it, really. Started climbing trees with ropes at the age of 15, 16, and haven't stopped, really. I've slowed down a lot, but I haven't stopped. Not
Wow.
yet.
I mean, you didn't start with anything that small, did you? Tell us about Goliath.
Yeah, so Goliath is a really, really special tree, and it's a redwood, a giant redwood, so sequoia dendron. And it grows in a very interesting part of the New Forest, a place called Rhinefield Ornamental Drive. And
I've been there. It's amazing, isn't it? You feel like like a tiny person with this huge cathedral-like landscape around you.
It's a little slice of Northern California. It's extraordinary. Especially in early spring when the air is just full of that sort of citrony smell of sap from the Douglas firs and things. And you'd be forgetting it has that sort of very calming, silent atmosphere that a lot of, old groves of conifers seem to exude. It's a very, very special place. And I'd been down there a few times as a kid, but I hadn't even noticed these trees to my shame. And then a friend of mine, Paddy, who was a tree surgeon, we'd stayed over at a friend of his house who was a rock climber. And he said, right, we're going to climb a tree today. So I sort of jumped in and thought, we're going to go and climb a beach or something. And then when we got to the base of the tree, bearing in mind I'd never worn a harness before or didn't even know what a carabiner was, and looking up at the first branch, which was, 30 or 35 feet up, as redwoods are, And I thought, how on earth are we going to climb this thing? And in 1990, I mean, there were no like big shot catapults or anything commercially available like that. And it was we tried throwing a bundle of rope up, and we were rubbish. So Paddy's mate Matt got out a pair of crampons and ice axes. And I thought, you're joking. And he climbed up to the first branch using ice climbing mountaineering equipment. And I thought, well, crikey, I don't know about this, stabbing into the tree. But of course, the bark is so thick. I mean, it's not something I would recommend, and not something I've ever done myself. But before too long, I found myself on the first branch. But I got a bit freaked out, and I only made it about halfway up the tree. Because of course, trees, especially trees that big, move, and I didn't really have a head for heights, if truth be told.
Oh, you didn't. So it wasn't something that you were born with. I mean,
no.
By coincidence, I've been out surveying all day today, and I've been surveying Sequoia dendron giganteum myself, actually in Hertfordshire, of all places, and thinking about it. And the tree was so large that my diameter tape ran out, and I had to use it twice to get the full girth of the tree. And
I can believe it.
Looking up and thinking, how on earth is your first big climb? So how did you get over your fear of heights? Was it sheer determination?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I got halfway up and froze and was just sort of left hugging this giant stem while teetering on a dead branch. And Matt and Paddy ran up to the top, and they were having fun and everything, came back down about an hour later, picked me up, and we all absolutely down. And I thought, well, that's probably not something I'm going to do again. But then on the weekend, Paddy said, well, do you want to come out again? And so it just got under the skin. And I thought, I took it on as a bit of a challenge. And I went away and started just on my own, as you did in those days, with no, thought to safety or anything really, just on a single point of attachment, and just went out and climbed any tree I could to try and push that threshold higher of my comfort zone. And the lure, the thing that drew me on and on, was because I was doing wildlife photography, and I was hugely into, not just megafauna, but also insects and macro photography and things. Just seeing the life the canopy of an oak or a beech supported made me realise that actually there's a whole world up here that no one is exploring, let alone photographing. And there were a couple of articles in National Geographic, but these were very exotic places that people were going to. And for me personally, just to see a sort of an oak, bush cricket, just that high up, and then just see it sort of jump off a leaf into the void and skydive with its antennae and legs. For me, that was at the age of 16 or 17, that was manna from heaven. I could almost believe I was in a rainforest, and it just got into me.
Fantastic. And you did go on to train as a cameraman, didn't you?
So I was doing a lot of local work, actually, as a camera assistant for several local wildlife cameramen. And there's a chap called Manny Hinge, who still lives in the New Forest. And he is an amazing cameraman. And I was lucky enough to camera assist him when I was a teenager. And he'd let me have a go on the camera and all of that. And I'd learned how to use cameras without the responsibility of having to deliver, basically. And then I went on to film school and did the university thing. And then when I came out, I just started, because I had the skill as a camera assistant, which basically just entails carrying other people's tripods, really, if I'm honest, but coupled with being able to rig trees and get cameramen up into the canopy so that they could film, then the two skills went quite well hand in hand. And then over the years, I started picking up more camera work and doing my own rigging to get myself into position. And then about 15 years ago, I took the leap to be a sort of full-time cameraman specialising in that, having learnt the ropes over quite a few years,
Fantastic. So tell us about your first big trip. Where did you go?
Well, the first one was, I had a mate who was a producer in the BBC in the Natural History Unit, and he was working on the Attenborough series Life of Birds at the time. An amazing man called Phil Hurrell, and he invited me into the NHU, the Natural History Unit, quite a few times, and we had sandwiches. And back in the days when you could drink a pint at lunchtime without getting, It was quite nice, to sit in the BBC canteen and just chat about birds and trees and things. But he had been freelance, but now he was in-house at the Beeb, so he couldn't take on any sort of external contract work. And someone asked him, being pretty much the only guy in Bristol, if not Britain, who was specialising in climbing big trees. I mean, Phil was a real pioneer on the TV front. And he kept getting people approaching him because he had been freelance, saying, "Can you go out and do this?" And he'd say, "No, because I work for the BBC full time now. I can't do that." So he started putting work my way. And one day he phoned me up. I was on set at Shepperton Studios in London on a big movie, and it was all going a bit pear-shaped. And I was feeling a bit disillusioned with my aspirations to go to Hollywood, and I was feeling a bit peevish and that. And the phone went, and it was Phil saying, "How do you want to go to Borneo?" And so this was 1998. And he'd been approached. He couldn't do the job, so he put it on to me. And that led to 6 or 7 weeks in the Danam Valley Conservation Area in Sabah in North Borneo, which is a 43,000 hectare area of pretty much pristine primary, sort of lowland Bitricarp forest. And that was just a mind-bending experience, and it just really, really blew me away on so many different levels.
I bet it did, because had you been somewhere like that before?
No.
So there was a climate, there was a culture, there was an incredible, fantastic treescape. And let's talk about kit for a little bit. So how did you prepare for such a trip, and what did you take, say somebody listening in Europe or North America now, listen to this podcast, what might they forget to take with them?
Well, that's a very good question. Very good question. And it's not just about the climbing kit as well. There are some other things, a lot of other things, which you wouldn't necessarily think would be important. But of course, working in the rainforest has its own challenges, just in terms of what you pack, just the side of the climbing kit. But I said to Phil that I'm going to need to get a rope up to trees, and this was before like the big catapults were commercially available and stuff. And he said, "Well, back up a sec. The first thing you've got to realise is you can't go around climbing with an old Willens leather harness with no leg loops anymore. You need to get savvy." So he suggested I did an industrial rope access climbing course. So I did my Errata level 1 in 97, I think that was. That was the technique that he advised that I use for climbing the big trees, because you just can't use, a lot of the trees there don't have branches for the first 110, 120 feet. And you just can't use ARB systems with friction hitches and prusik loops. Even with the modern sort of, variety of friction hitches and, hitchmaster pulleys and all this sort of stuff, it's still a big ask in 35 degrees, 100% humidity to sort of do that sort of thrusting body action all the way up to the first branch.
You'd just be exhausted and dehydrated.
It would just absolutely rinse you. And however strong and fit you are, and I was, as fit as a butcher's dog then. I'm not so much now, of course, but I was a rabid climber back then. But it was just too much to even consider doing it that way. So he suggested I use what's essentially SRT, and Errata is derived from caving, mountaineering, and all sorts of techniques, which is then transposed for industrial climbing. So I got onto the SRT system.
Could you just say, for benefit of listeners, including me, what's SRT, please?
Single rope technique. So
okay. Have silly questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, it's not. It's and there's a lot of different systems out there, and it's not to say that one is any better than the other. But the good thing about the SRT system, which I was using, the industrial, is that it has a sort of sternal point of attachment as your primary point when you're ascending. And the nice thing about that is that you don't have to waste your energy holding yourself upright if you want to have a breather halfway up. So it's a very ergonomic and comfortable way of climbing. And it's a very efficient way of climbing. And in that sort of heat and humidity, it paid dividends. So you could take your time. You didn't rely on your own energy levels or momentum to just build inertia to get up there. But of course, the big problem is, how do you get the rope up there in the first place? You can't just throw it up. Phil introduced me to the idea of using catapults, and I had an old Black Widow catapult, just a little wrist rocket. And of course, the limitation with those old small, sort of hobby catapults is their power. They can only shoot very small projectiles. So I'd use ledger weights from my cousin was into carp fishing, so he gave me some of his little weights and things from his fishing kit, and I tied that onto very, very thin line. I suspended a poncho at sort of chest height with bungee cords to 4 saplings. And then I draped the cord over the poncho, down in the loop, back over the poncho, down in the loop, back over the poncho. It took about 20 minutes to set up. But the good thing about that is when you actually shot it up with the catapult, there was no friction or resistance, and the whole lot just leapt up in the air. And with a small catapult and with a small weight, that was enough weight to overcome the weight of the line, pull it over the branch, come down. But of course, you end up in a lot of tangles. You spend a lot of time untangling, line in the forest. But of course, since then, there are a lot more efficient techniques now. I mean, within the last 15 to 20 years, it just amazes me the level of technology and thought and expertise which has gone into tree access and climbing into the canopy. Specialist catapults, specialist throw bags, low friction line. None of that existed back then. So on the one hand, it was great fun trying to improvise, but on the other hand, it wasn't always the most efficient process it could have been.
And what about, because you go up to the trees and you sleep in the tree as well, don't you? And some of the really tall trees. So describe how you sleep in a tree. It sounds utterly terrifying to me.
Well, the first thing is you always stay in the harness and you always stay attached to the actual rope that you're on. So you become quite adept at sleeping on your back quite quickly, because of course you've got carabiners coming in and stuff. And in a hammock, you don't really want to be rolling around anyway. But I find it actually extremely enjoyable, as long as the weather's playing ball. It's the weather that's the big issue, really, because you're in a very big emergent tree. If that's what you're sleeping in, then you really are at the mercy. That's the big sort of selective pressure on these big trees, isn't it? It's the weather. It's the lightning. The air displacement in front of a heavy downpour in the tropics is really quite shocking. It blows the canopy around all over the place. And if that comes in at 2 or 3 in the morning, when you're so exhausted from the day's climbing that you just completely sparko, it can be pretty disorientating. But I always sleep with my descender, my abseil device already loaded. So even if I'm half asleep, all I've got to do is pitch out the side of the hammock, pull the handle.
What a way to wake up! Oh my goodness! I mean, let's just remember how tall these trees are. I mean, what sort of height you talking about, the emergent trees in the tropical rainforest?
Well, it varies a lot, but in Borneo, where the tallest tropical trees undoubtedly are, there are like the Mangaris tree, which is Compassia excelsa, which is a type of legume, actually. That's up to about 80, 82, 85 meters tall. But superseding that are some of the ditch carp. If they grow in the right place, in a gully where they have that microclimate and they can really race against other trees that pushes them up high, you're talking up to about 90 meters, 92 meters. And so if you start taking the average in terms of, I forget what it's called, but there's a type of, it's a type of index that ecologists use to measure the profile and the structure of a forest. I can't remember what it's called. But what you do in any given forest, I'm led to believe, or any given country, is you take the top 5 or 6 tallest species of trees. You take the tallest known specimen of each, and then you take an average, and that gives you that particular index. So obviously somewhere like California and Oregon has an extremely tall index, because you're dealing obviously with the Douglas firs and the redwoods and the Sitka spruces and hemlocks and things. And so Britain would have a sort of middle of the road, middle of the range sort of index, really. But Borneo has an index right up there with Oregon, which is extraordinary because there are no conifers growing in those forests. These are all hardwoods. And when you think about the associated mass that a broadleaf canopy holds compared to a conifer, it just makes it all the more amazing that there are tropical forests like that, where the trees aren't just as tall as, almost as tall as redwoods, and definitely as tall as Douglas firs and Sitka spruce, but that they are also carrying these massive limbs, and each branch is the size of a European lime tree or an oak. They're phenomenal things.
So, when you're climbing the tree, you must go through a series of different ecosystems. Describe what it's like at the bottom, and as you go up, what do you see what sort of privilege is it to see all these different insects and birds and mammals?
The understory at the base of the tree tends to be quite dark, musty, humid. It's dominated by the soil and the smells, decay, rot. It sounds a bit sort of dark and ghoulish and gothic, but it's not actually. You still get an overwhelmingly positive impression of life. It's just not as light tolerant. It just seems to be a bit more claustrophobic and locked in. And then as you start to move up as you start to climb, you get to the understory. You sort of climb through the shrub layer, and then you get to the understory, which is the first layer of lower canopy. It could start at 20 feet and go on until 120 feet, or it could be pretty uniform, and you might not reach it until 60 or 70 feet up. But sooner or later, you will sort of go into, having gone through an open space, low down where it's dark and humid, you'll go into the understory, which can be a fascinating habitat in its own right. Very tangled, very convoluted, very intricate. A lot of lianas, a lot of vines, a lot of debris, a lot of dirt and dead branches, dead leaves, compost which has fallen from above and has been sort of ensnared in this floating layer. And that's where a lot of the animals and the insects are found. It's quite a sort of friendly environment for them. There's a lot of food there, a lot of insects, a lot of foraging, a lot of primates hang out there. And then passing through there is really your first glimpse, certainly in Borneo, of the upper levels into that cathedral space. You enter the bowl zone, which can be anything from 40 or 50 up to 80 or 90 foot of nothing but tree stems. And you feel very exposed. You get the full force of the tropical sun. Humidity drops down hugely. You really start sweating. And it tends to be, as beautiful as it is, it's quite a harsh environment. And you tend to sort of push on until you can get up higher. And then you start picking up the shadow of the branches above you on the trunk. You start entering that shade. And then you get up into the canopy of the tree itself. And that can be a lot drier, more like a desert. So certainly with an emergent tree, a lot of the epiphytes, which you might find in the understory, which tend to be quite lush, there's a lot of moisture trapped into those little microclimates down there. By the time you get into the higher canopy, it really is more like a desert. So you start noticing that, like, the epiphytes have sort of waxy cuticles on the leaves. They're quite fleshy. They're almost like those money plants that you get in the houses, with the fleshy leaves. And they're very much almost like cacti, really. You tend to find quite a few orchids with pseudo bulbs, which can actually store the water from the last rainfall and meet it out over the dry season. And then when you get really, really high up into the upper branches of the emergent, which is quite difficult to do, and I haven't managed to do that as often as I'd like, because the branches are obviously a lot more spindly, and it depends a lot on the actual structure of the tree you're climbing as to whether it will tolerate your weight that high. But if you do get up there and manage to stick your head out of the top, that's, you get the breeze and everything, but it is very, very hot and exposed.
Gosh, and the first time you did that, did it change your view of nature and the world? Did it really enlighten you? Did you feel different when you've climbed your first massive tree in the tropics?
Most absolutely, definitely, absolutely. I've got a lot of mates who are really into rock climbing and mountaineering, and I'm a rubbish rock climber. I don't have the strength to weight ratio for it. But in truth, I've never really tried because it's never captivated me, because essentially at the end of the day, however amazing a rock climb is, you're still climbing a dead, inert, inanimate object. Well, hopefully inanimate. Trees are totally different. And part of the attraction for me has always been the fact that they are living entities, and they are responsive, well, very responsive to the environment, just obviously on a different time scale to us. And that is a big factor for me. So climbing a large tropical tree of that sort of size, it has an energy of its own, I personally believe and I feel. And that definitely is quite a humbling experience. And then I find that, the sheer amount of life and diversity of life that a lot of these trees support is so utterly overwhelming. And to be immersed in that, it's like diving in on the most perfect coral reef you could ever imagine for the first time. To go up into a tree like that, where there's just so much life, is just a very, very humbling experience. And it makes you feel, or it made me feel, extremely insignificant, but in a good way, not in a browbeating, intimidating way. It made me feel like, actually, I'm just another animal. I'm another little clock in this infinitely exquisite Swiss watch of an ecosystem. And I'm just here, and everything else is around me doing its thing. And, it's just a very, very almost spiritual experience I found. And
I'm quite sure.
And it moved me hugely. Yeah, absolutely did. It was a real eye-opener for me to see just how much life is suspended up in that sort of, floating kingdom.
Yeah, I love that phrase, floating kingdom. And in your book, you say one tree, many worlds. And it's really captivating. And as much as all wildlife is good, you've had your sort of interesting moments up in the trees, haven't you? Some bees were quite friendly with you at one stage.
Yeah, honeybees and social insects are a real threat. Well, they're not a threat. That sounds a bit all, sort of...
They're a hazard.
They are a hazard, and they are a potential hazard that you ignore at your peril, really. When they're foraging, they're absolutely fine. They're not a problem, The rarest thing the rarest resource in the forest, in the rainforest, one of the rarest things is salt. And of course, when you're climbing, you're sweating constantly. And the sweat isn't doing its job properly because you're wearing a shirt which is already soaked, humidity's high, so evaporation isn't happening, you're not cooling, so your body produces more and more sweat. And it's quite dangerous feedback you have to be careful of. But essentially, there's no avoiding the fact that you're going to be like wringing with sweat. And a lot of insects, particularly honeybees, like that salt, and they come in and they start treating you like a resource. So they'll just and they lick the moisture that's wicking through your clothes. And
it's a bit like my golden retriever sticking my feet in the summer.
Yeah,
probably too much information.
No, that's exactly it. They salt is, there's a reason why salt was a currency in places like Papua New Guinea and everything, and why coastal peoples, that's how they traded inland and in various times. It's because they had this thing that just made life worth living. Everything loves salt. It enhances in flavor. We need it, and of course insects need it just as much. And so when they find a resource, a sweating climber, a sweaty Englishman 200 feet off the ground, they'll come in. And that's fine because they're not aggressive when they're foraging. But when you lean forward, invariably they'll climb down between the back of your harness and the small of your back, and then you lean back and you get zapped a couple of times. And that could be painful, but it doesn't elicit an attack. But I have had a couple of incidents, one in particular in Central Africa, in Gabon, in a national park called Loango, which is pretty much where the Congo rainforest comes down to the Atlantic. It's an extraordinary place. There are elephants, there are hippos in the surf, can you believe? There are elephants on the beach, crocodiles actually in the forest lying on game trails waiting for pigs. It's that sort of real Tarzan type place. And I was climbing up there doing a survey on a big hardwood in which we were hoping to build a tree house for a film project. There was a beautiful big hardwood tree, gorgeous thing. And I was just so happy and excited to find the perfect tree for that tree house. I just, in my own fault, I got too eager. I didn't survey it properly with binoculars beforehand. I went up and climbed into a hidden bee hive. And the thing about bees, of course, is they're cavity nesters. They're not like a wasp nest or a hornet, which hangs down like a giant Christmas bauble, which you spot. The bees are quite hidden away. So the first you know about it, one will come down, as this one did, hovered in front of me, just stung me on the head. And that was all right. But then, of course, it brings all its mates back. And I would say within about 10 seconds, they were going up my nose, they were crawling in my eyes, and I had them in my mouth. They were in my ears. They'd gone through the air vents on my climbing helmet. They'd gone down my back. I had to do a changeover, and luckily I was above a lagoon. The tree grew out over this inland lagoon, and I abseiled straight down into the water and went underwater. And some of the bees were even, stinging me underwater. I crawled to the bank, got myself up on the roots, very delirious. Just dropped my harness, left it hanging on the rope, and staggered up the path, and felt very woozy, was throwing up and all of that, and eventually crawled back to camp. And I think I had between 60 and 70 stings. And these African honeybees they're quite full on. They draw blood when they really pack a punch. And of course, the main thing that they're protecting from, of course, is gorillas and chimps, who are incredibly tough primates, but being just a different sort of primate, a much softer primate, of course, they knew exactly where to attack, because the vulnerable place on a chimp, of course, is the eyes and the mouth and nose. So that was deeply unpleasant. And I've had a couple of incidents like that with various insects over the years, and it happens so quickly and it's so shocking. And it's really very, very scary indeed.
I bet it is.
If you're feeling vulnerable or worried for your day, we know she interviews the best, from Santa Fe to Dungeness, from mental health to happiness. Tree Lady talks to you today.
A really memorable part of the book for me was a nasty little rash you got in the Congo.
Yeah,
That's quite the story.
Yeah. So I was in a national park called Odzala, and it still exists as a national park. It's a very, very big area of land, as most of the African national parks are. I mean, they make our, Snowdonia or the New Forest or the Cape Coast just look like, like nothing. The size of these parks is bewildering, and Odzala is very, very remote. And I was doing some camera assisting work there for a National Geographic stills photographer. We were doing a series of articles called Mega Transect about a chap called Mike Fay, who was transecting the whole of the Congo doing a wildlife survey. And so this was 1999, and I was the camera assistant for this stills photographer, Nick Nichols. And Nick had gone upriver and to get some stuff, and I was feeling a bit rough, so he said, okay, well, you stay here in camp, catch me up when you can. I was feeling a bit rough, started feeling even rougher. I was on my own in a tent on the bank of this river in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the rainforest. It was just raining incessantly, and I had these sort of welts. They were like pimples, which covered my right leg right across my midriff, up over my back, over my shoulder. They were everywhere, right across my crotch, on my bum, just everywhere. It was deeply unpleasant. And they were getting bigger and bigger. And I thought, wow, it must just be, maybe it's thorns, maybe they're ticks, maybe it's just a little bit of infected hair follicle or something. I mean, it's impossible to stay dry and clean out there. And as time went on, they started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I remember one night I was trying to sleep, and I just heard and felt this grating on the bone in my skull. I thought, hang on, this is really not good. There's something in the flesh on my skull that's basically eating it's got mouth parts. I could feel it. It was gnawing. And I thought, it's got to be botfly. These got to be maggots. But I had no idea how to get rid of them. And I tried to lance one, on my thigh, thinking that I could draw it out. But it was naive and stupid. I just managed driving the big needle through the maggot, deeper into the flesh. My thigh went infected. It all turns nasty. Were
you still on your own at this point?
Yeah,
James?
totally on my own. I was about probably about a week in. I mean, Nick was just doing his thing. He was upriver, and we had no comms, no communication at all.
And I bet you're thinking, why didn't I just stay and just film something nice and safe and boring?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
like,
yeah. So carry on. Sorry, I love this story.
Well, I was sort of, I had a whole stack of antibiotics, and this is it, judge me if you will, but I also had a bottle of whiskey, and it was about the only thing that was keeping my morale up at the time.
I think I'd judge you if you didn't, quite frankly.
So I was loaded up with antibiotics and self administering, the occasional dram or 3, and quietly losing the plot, just not knowing what was going on. There's all sorts of weird diseases like Ebola and all sorts that crops up around there. And until I actually realised it was a maggot, I didn't know what it was. So I was kind of going a bit loopy and the plot. And one day I was standing out in my underpants in the hacking rain, just on the banks of the river, just staring at the rain coming down like a waterfall. And a boat with anti-poaching patrol for the national park came past, and there were a bunch of local lads, all armed to the teeth with Kalashnikovs and pistols and all sorts, and they're all in their camouflage, uniforms and things. I remember just hailing them from the riverbank, and my schoolboy French is so bad, and I just said, I need help. Send help. Can you help me? And they just looked at me it was almost as though they were, they didn't believe that, any of their colleagues had even seen the same weird apparition, some ghostly white pasty Englishman in his Marks and Spencer's pants standing on the riverbank, slightly drunk, obviously very, very ill, trying to flag them down. So clearly they were never going to stop. They just got out of there as quickly as possible, looking quite worried. But to their credit, they must have sent someone up from camp headquarters, which is like a day and a half or 2 days that further down the river. And about 3 days later, a Bayaka pygmy bush doctor walked out of the trees.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you there. Did you say 3 days? Presumably the whiskey's gone at this stage.
Yeah, it has.
And maybe the underpants aren't as clean.
Yeah.
3 days.
Yeah, so
Oh.
And I'd been there in total for well over a week trying to sort it out. And this bush doctor just turned up. He couldn't speak any English. I couldn't speak any of Bayaka. And he had a little plastic film canister full of palm oil. And he sat me down. I was in my underpants and that, and I just gave up the ghost. I was like, look, this complete stranger, and he's rubbing palm oil on these pimples on my skin and stuff. And I thought, this is a pretty random scenario. But he seemed to know what he was doing, so I let him get on with it. And he just said, wait. And he waited about 5 minutes. And quite a few of the pimples have developed air holes, and that's how the maggot breathes. And if you cover it with oil, which I didn't know at the time, but he clearly did, the maggot gets restless because the maggot's covered in tiny little spines that means you can't get it out quickly. But it gets restless because it doesn't have oxygen. So it starts to head up towards the hole. And at that point, you can squeeze it like a zit and out the maggot comes. Quite painful. And I had them everywhere, right across my midriff on, in rather unfortunate places. So I squeezed those ones out myself. I knew. But yeah, it was quite an ordeal. But thankfully, there was no lasting, it wasn't a disease, basically, which was my main.
No, you were just fresh meat.
Fresh meat, exactly. And that's the other thing about rainforests. Very often, you quite quickly you realise that it's that phrase, life is nature's way of keeping meat fresh. And you are basically just a sack of protein to be raided. And I tracked it back to, because we'd been working in a camp where we couldn't light a fire, and so we couldn't dry any clothes. And that was because we didn't want the smoke to scare away the wildlife we were filming. So we had 2 sets of clothes, and Nick, the photographer, would walk in his wet clothes to the hives, then he would change into dry clothes. I was in a canopy hide, so I would walk in my wet clothes, change into my dry, climb up, sit in my dry all day, come down, change back into my wet, walk back, change back into my dry and sleep. But I got caught out in a rainstorm when I was up in the tree. So I had 2 sets of soaking clothes. And the issue with that is that these large botfly, they're large black flies with red eyes. They come in and they actually lay eggs on wet clothing, just as they do on the wet hides of primates and antelope and things. And that egg hatches into a microscopic maggot that goes in through one of the hair follicles and then gets bigger and bigger inside. So Nick never got it because he in his moments of exposure, he was always in a dry set of clothes, but I was continuously wearing wet, clothes, and that's why I got targeted. But yeah.
Wow, well done. But it's not all bad, is it? Because you keep coming back, and I think you've just come back from a trip, haven't you, James?
I've just come back from a month in the Congo, again, actually, in Central African Republic, filming forest elephants out there. So, yeah, that's a challenge in itself. They're very, very special animals. But very secretive and extremely difficult to find. You'd think that an elephant would be an easy thing to find in the forest, but they really aren't, despite a relatively high population. And they're very aggressive, and they're quite difficult to work around. And obviously you're on foot. But what we were hoping to do was to get behaviour of elephants feeding at a certain fruiting tree. And in order to do that, to be safe, you've got to be off the ground. So that's where the tree climbing comes in. So for the last month, I had a filming platform, but I also had a rock climbing portaledge with a rain fly on it suspended. So I was there with a couple of other guys, and I went up at midday each day on this rolling shift. I'd stay there for the afternoon, sleep all night in the tree, then get up before dawn, back on the platform to man the cameras, and go until the following midday. And then Aidan and Ewan would come out very quietly because the place is crawling with elephants. They would then, I would come down silently, they would climb up, and they would do the next 24-hour shift.
Find out more about James at jamesaldred.com. You can also see the video version of this episode, which is well worth watching if you want to see me go off a cliff, on YouTube, SHA Sharon Hosegood Associates.
So what would you say to anybody who's thinking of taking up tree climbing but is scared?
There's a lot of machismo involved with any form of sort of climbing and all of that, and it can be a bit of a turn-off, especially if you feel like other people are watching you and you feel obliged to step out of your comfort zone. But I think that would be a mistake. If you're nervous and you're scared about tree climbing, but you still feel like there's a world up there you want to explore, just take it at your own pace. Just find someone who's willing to show you the techniques, and then just explore and play. It doesn't matter if you're only 10 feet, 20 feet off the ground. It's just the sensation, for me, of hanging in a harness, being connected to this much larger older, bigger life form, I find really quite compelling.
Well, I listened to a wonderful scheme in Japan called Tree Hab at the Arboricultural Association conference,
Yeah,
where young disabled people are taken up into the trees with some arborists
yeah,
in harnesses, and they experience such joy and freedom, because particularly if somebody's in a wheelchair,
yeah,
to be able to experience being up in the canopy,
yeah.
it's been really transformative, but not only for the participants, but also for those helping as well. I think there's something really in our DNA about climbing trees and being close to trees. It's part of us.
I couldn't agree more. It's very interesting, because when I wrote that book, I didn't know where to pin my colours in terms of talking about the more spiritual side of trees and our relationship with them. I actually used to do a few sort of kids climbing experiences, and on one occasion, memorable occasion, we did take a disabled lad up, and his face just came alive. It just lit up,
Yeah.
and there was something else going on. It wasn't just sight, sound, touch, and there was just something else going on there, which kind of defies description, really.
And I think even since you've written this book, which is about 4 or 5 years ago, I think the understanding of the spiritual connection between people and trees, and how we are all one, is really, really grown. And I really welcome
Me too.
people understanding that. This was never going to be a conversation about what's the best kit, how fast you climb, what's the biggest tree. It's about that joyful feeling of connection and reverence
Yeah.
for variety of nature.
But
Brilliant.
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, trees are the secret of humanity's success.
Absolutely, they are. I mean, without wishing to, I will harp on about a previous interview, but I interviewed Professor Roland Dennis at the beginning of this series about how the wood age, the book is called, how it's shaped our evolution. Everything from even being able to sleep in the trees and make a nest,
Yeah.
so our brains grew.
Absolutely agree. Opposable thumbs, forward-facing eyes, all of this sort of stuff. And it's very easy for people to say, oh, well, we've lost all of that and we have to relearn it, and we're clumsy around in trees. Well, I might be pretty clumsy in that, but you watch, some of the the competitions these days and the way people move around. Okay, they've got ropes and all that, but I work with the most talented tree climber I've ever met. It's a chap called Tom Greenwood in Australia, in Melbourne. And he was the Australian tree climbing champion several times running. But he just had a fluidity, grace, strength, and poise in those big tropical trees, which just begged belief. He would run out on a branch and take these massive leaps, like 40 feet, to another branch and just land and run in, and he'd be taken in and slack and everything. And I remember watching him and thinking, it's still there, it's still in us. It just takes a bit of unlocking, And I also strongly believe that we still associate heights with safety. Most of us have our bedrooms up on the first floor. It's not a coincidence, I think, that most of the large apes in rainforest locations sleep at exactly that height in the understory. They sleep one story up in 10 to 15 feet off the ground. That's where they make their nests, and that's where they feel safe. And okay, we're not likely to have to worry about leopards prowling around downstairs, but we in the world we live in, we're all conscious of burglaries and things like that. And I think it taps in very deep into this association where we've always seen trees as a refuge and an escape. And certainly in a place like the Congo, where I've just been working, you get caught out on the ground at night time and you might be all right, but there's a very, very good chance that you really aren't going to be okay, because there's a lot of very, very big things moving around silently that you just don't see. And if they come across you, they're going to kill you. I mean, that's just, you blunder into an elephant in the pitch dark and it is going to have you, a forest elephant. So I still think that a lot of that stuff is in us, and we've just transposed it, and it's evolved and developed with us. But kids love climbing trees, as we all know, and I think that's still part of our DNA, part of our makeup.
I absolutely agree with you. Well, James, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much indeed.
That was absolutely brilliant. Is there anything else you would like to say? Noel, is there anything you want to add?
I have a question.
It's Noel's question of the week.
Yeah,
So we have a little jingle that goes, Noel's question of the week.
Hear it. Don't talk about it.
Okay.
Noel's question of the week.
Is it better being behind the camera or up the tree?
Well, both at the same time is the ideal. But I think I'm up a tree, and if I'm up a tree when I don't have a camera, it means that I'm climbing it for fun, and that's very hard to beat.
And that was
Noel's question of the week.
I got you under my skin. Oh, it's a butterfly. I tell you what, you've got to have a truckload of respect for the man who tried to lance a botfly. I mean, just think about that for a second over your toast and sandwiches. Yes, mother, I had a very nice day at work today. I popped up a tree. I fell asleep for a bit. I lanced a botfly, and you think you got a hard job? I tell you, you haven't. You haven't. Yeah. James actually chooses to do this. I mean, someone's got to. Oh, it's a funny thing. It's a funny thing, wildlife. Bees, botflies. And it may be that you remember Xander Johnson talking about flies and insects and everything that he does, marvellous chap that he is. And Xander, if you're listening to this, give us a shout and we'll put you in touch with James. You can have a cross party chat about the various ways of getting rid of insects that decide to get under your skin. 2 reminders from me before you go. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share it with your friends and family, and you can consider subscribing to the show to make sure you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on our YouTube channel, which is SHA Sharon Hosegood Associates. This video will be on that. You can get us on Instagram, which is @TreeLadyUK, and on the website treeladytalks.co.uk. Thanks for listening.